Bienvenidos a un capítulo más de Diálogos Sensoriales. En esta ocasión estoy altamente nervioso. Tengo el placer enorme de hacer una de las entrevistas que más había esperado en este momento y quisiera darle la bienvenida, probablemente ya lo vieron, ya lo conocen, al doctor Herbert Stone. Herbert, thank you so much, doctor, for accepting me this interview. I am very pleased to interchange some words with you. Thank you and welcome.
Gracias, señor.
Ah,
Dispense-me, yo hablo muy poquito español.
perfect.
So we must talk I must talk in English.
Great. No, that's fine. And you can practice Spanish if you want it.
Oh, no.
Okay. So let's as I was saying, thank you so much, and let's start this conversation with a big question I always have in my mind. Why and how did you start doing sensory evaluation?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I often ask myself the same question. Well, in fact, I'd always been interested in food. And at a relatively young age, I used to do a lot of cooking at home on weekends.
Wow.
And so I was interested in food. And when I went to university, I was a food technology, food science major. And I was at the University of Massachusetts, and the department chair was a very famous professor, Carl Fellers, who was also past president of IFT. And he was very interesting professor. He was very personable. He was always involved asking questions about things. And I remember clearly he would come into the laboratory where we did our first laboratory class, and we were making various products at that time in New England. So we made apple cider and apple jam. And he would walk in and immediately say, well, what are you doing? And put his hand out and put it in every sample we had. And he was busy tasting. And he was very famous for doing this. And he was always saying, you can see how easy it is to make a product. But what he said was more important, how good does it taste?
Right.
So I thought that was always quite interesting. And my senior year, I took a class, and he gave me a special project to write up a study about mate, which, as you know, is Central South America. I had never heard of it, so it was quite interesting. And he told me I should learn about how it's used and the way it's prepared and what it tasted like. So I did some simple taste tests, so in my report I could show something about what the product tasted like. Then I finished university, and I spent several years in Korea as a soldier. And I was pulled out of the front lines because there was big problems with the food. And I was involved in quartermaster and helping create better food, because all the soldiers would complain to their congressional visitors who would come to see them, complaining the worst thing was the food. So everybody was complaining about it.
Wow.
So that I had a team. So that continued my interest in food. And when I went out to start my doctoral program at University of California at Davis, a number of the faculty would be doing research of one type or another, and they were also doing taste tests. And it was probably around 1960, it's a long time ago, when the Department of Food Science wanted to formalize taste testing. Because as an agricultural school, they were always doing harvesting and testing new crops. So that was the beginning of sensory evaluation in the United States when Rosemary Pangborn established a curriculum, a series of classes, courses in sensory. And I was the only student that was doing sensory evaluation, or at the time doing some part of my thesis work. And I was also the original teaching assistant. And so I learned a lot because before the Monday before the first lecture, there would be a gathering of some professors with Rosemary. They had me sit in and they were sitting saying, okay, what do we do in this lecture? And so that's how the program began. And that was my really beginning of my complete commitment to sensory evaluation. So when I finished my doctorate, I went to Stanford, and I had some flexibility given to me. So I spent my time developing a sensory testing capability at Stanford at the research center. So that's where it all began.
Wow, amazing. It's amazing. Well, normally I hear that during a teaching class, but now that you are saying that experience from your uh, mouth or your words, it's like thrilling. I mean, it's nice. I can imagine all the steps you have been through this sensory life. And that leads me to the next question about how or okay, you start doing sensory, but did you have any inspiration about, okay, this is the thing I want to do for not the rest of your professional life, but the main time in your professional life?
I would say that I had ideas, but there was no precedent. There was no history.
Mhm.
The people, there were any number of faculty at Davis who were doing different kinds of work, and involved at some point they would do a taste test. And there was always discussions, well, how would we do a test? Who would be subjects? Questions like that. And in the 1950s, there was quite a bit of work going on. I mean, I would say quite a bit of work in the context of sensory. It was pretty trivial, but it was very interesting work that was being done. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, from a point of view of food companies, there were a number of food companies at the time that were doing taste testing, but the problem was everybody used a different method.
Right.
There were no real established methods. And some of the big questions in the 50s, well, the biggest one was who should be the subjects? The initial reaction was, well, we'll use the people in the laboratory because they know what they're doing. And then some work had been done that demonstrated they didn't.
Right.
That there was what ultimately we learned, what they learned was that it took something called knowing if the subjects knew how to take a test and how to use the senses. This was a big difference. That if you just took people literally off the street or from you're in the laboratory in a food company, people come by and say, would you like to do a taste test? Come in and you do a test. And the other part that was a bit interesting was that most of the companies, usually the larger ones, had quality control activities. I guess all food companies had some form of quality control doing taste tests. They would do the day after production, they would do what is called a cutting session, where they would take the yesterday's shift production and they would walk through and taste the samples and make some judgments about them.
Right.
So there was that going on, but nothing was quantified, everything was qualified, and there was a lot of deferential to superior management. If a senior manager was there, people would kind of look out of the corner of their eyes trying to second guess what he was, at that point, I should say what he, because there were no she's. They were all in white coats and tennis shoes and serving the samples to these managers. Everybody's trying to read the mind of the senior manager, but each company was doing things a little bit differently. And if you were able to get them to speak frankly, openly, they would tell you they're not really sure what they're doing, but they do it because it seems to work.
Correct.
So there were a lot of interesting opportunities, but there was no real, the only U.S. Army Food and Container Institute that was then located in Chicago, but eventually they moved to Massachusetts. So there was no formal organization. If you gathered all the sensory people in the United States, you'd probably have 25 people in the room at best.
Wow.
So there weren't very many people. Everybody had different problems, and they're not sure where to go and how to do it, which is why when Rosemary Pangborn began producing students and teaching them basic principles, from input from psychology and mathematics, these students suddenly became in great demand. There was a lot of interest in them. And I was busy doing both my research and contract work at Stanford.
Right.
And so that was in the, when you were in the 1960s, there was some developments. Other universities were noticing that Rosemary Pangborn was being successful in making a lot of good progress and providing training for undergraduates that had begun to collect more interest. And I would say that in the mid-60s, the Institute of Food Technologists formed some kind of an informal committee on the topic of what to do about sensory evaluation or sensory testing, because some of us we were writing letters to the editors of Journal of Food Science, well, it was Food Research then, and Food Technology, and complaining that they were publishing results, including sensory, that was seen to us all wrong and why. And because of that, we were able to put together a plan, which eventually, among other things, led to formation of the Sensory Evaluation Division at IFT. In the same time period, ASTM had formed a committee on sensory evaluation. ASTM's the subcommittee E18 was consisted of people from not only food but also home care, personal care, fragrances. So you had a real conglomerate, and they all came with methods they were using they thought were not right, or they wanted ASTM to certify their company's method as right so they could all be successful. Of course, this is a dream that didn't quite work, but it was in the 60s when sensory evaluation began to develop, and we actually were able to have symposia at the annual IFT meetings where we would take on topics of interest, and we had this sensory committee which eventually morphed into the Sensory Evaluation Division, officially recognized IFT. So that was really the beginnings. And I should point out that the sensory people in the United States were not alone. There were people in Europe, there were people in Central and South America that were having interested in sensory and experiencing same problems.
And how was, I mean, it's amazing the history, but how was or how difficult was to struggle with the idea of that sensory doesn't work? I mean, at the beginning, of course. Okay, I know that nowadays there are companies or people who don't believe in sensory, but at that time, how was trying to say, okay, you need some methodologies or some statistics or some procedures to do sensory. Was it difficult?
Well, I can tell you it was not easy. First of all, at universities, it was relatively easy. Send them a course curriculum and they're happy and we'll teach.
Right.
In industry, there was a lot of resentment. The technical people, even to this day, maybe it's changed, I doubt it, felt challenged by the presence of some sensory testing. So they were always coming up with examples of where it failed, it didn't work, you know, or some other reasoning to complain about it. So it was always a question of if you were in my instance, we would be called into a company because we had met somebody at a conference who wanted to know if we could come in and talk with them about sensory testing because they weren't sure what they were doing was right, or the information they were getting, they couldn't act on it because it didn't seem to make sense.
Right.
So in the beginning, and I would say we were not alone in this, this was always a problem for a sensory scientist in the 60s, 70s, 80s, because there would be, if not technical resistance, there might be quality control resistance. They would think you're going to change what they're doing, or there would be people in market research that thought you were going to be doing testing and take over what they're doing. So there was a lot of turf wars. That's a sort of probably old, outdated statement, but there was a lot. There was resistance, and that resistance often is still found today. You find companies do and contract with you to do work. They tell you what they want to use the information for, and you organize, you field the test, you give them the results. They don't like the results, so immediately they want to attack what you've done. And the typical one was you would have a second meeting with them, maybe a few weeks later from the first meeting. And in the room would be a couple of strangers. You never met them. Oh, these are outside people, and they're going to find out that, you know, and you would have these, and then they bring in statisticians who would complain that you're doing, oh, if you do repeated trials, you're going to have a dependent error, and it's going to be biased now. We're going to see, and here's this, like, well, you know, so you had statistical warfare, you had engineering warfare, you had technology warfare, and you had the sensory people in the middle of all this. So I would say in the beginning, it was very challenging. Everything you did was scrutinized with great detail. And some companies just decided they didn't want to do this. Other companies saw what it could do, used it effectively, and suddenly you couldn't do enough for them in terms of research and, testing, getting a better understanding of how you use this kind of information.
Right. And how did you came with the idea of doing a QDA? You know QDA, right?
Oh, in the 50s, as you know, when Arthur D. Little introduced flavor profile, it had an allure that was really interesting. It was the initial type of descriptive analysis. It demonstrated that you could take people that aren't scientifically trained and they could provide you with actionable kinds of information. And concurrent with that, there were psychologists who questioned in great detail some of the problems with these group effort and pointing out that a group of judgments is not the same as a group judgment, which is very critical. The group judgment is a consensus. You can't do statistics on that.
Right.
And the statisticians were saying, you got to be careful. The psychologists were concerned about group behavior and the impact of one individual over the other, and so forth. And so when I arrived at Stanford, as I said, most of the time we were doing contract work because it was a research center. And I was busy doing that, but on the side, and the institute had this policy of saying, if there's some research you want to work on, we might be able to find some money to support it, so you didn't have to be all the time busy on contract work.
Mm-hmm.
So I had the fortune to be working with some experimental psychologists who, when I gave them all the literature, some of them came back to me and said, "What the hell is this? Excuse my language. What is this? What are they doing? This is not the right way to do things." I said, "Well, I'm interested in doing something different, and I think there's a better way to do this." So I began to do little projects on the side in the 60s. And over, I would say, 7, 8 years, we did a lot of research, almost all of which we never published. We were just kind of going along. And we developed this methodology. And the mathematician that I was working with was brilliant mathematician who was fascinated by the work we were doing and thinking about how do you quantify and analyze the information. So there was some literature on some aspects of what I was doing. For example, how many subjects should you use in a small panel test? Mm-hmm. So we had panels of 10 people, 12. We did some studies with as many as between 10 and 20 people. We'd collect the data and see if the results, the conclusions changed as the number of subjects increased. And then we also would do things like look at the error rates, the variance measures, etc. And what we discovered was after about 10 to 12 people, it made no difference. The only thing that happened was the significances would be, instead of 2 decimal places, would be 3 or 4. And that didn't mean it was better data. It's just, so why would you do it? So through trial and error, we developed a process, and we recognized what were the problems that had been attached to flavor profile. Subjects, why did you need 3 months to train the subjects? So we used a procedure that took us a week to screen subjects to identify those who could discriminate it better than chance. The measurement people I worked with, the psychologists there, they had pointed out that, you have to use some kind of measurement technique, but they said don't use numbers because people will think they remember numbers, and so they'll try to remember them and you won't get the information you want. So, well, but this just evolved over a period of time. And the first time we did this, they using a simpler version of descriptive analysis of quantitative. Pillsbury, which doesn't exist anymore as a company, so I can talk about it. So anyway, they were interested in the cake mix and what happens if you bake it too long or you bake it too short. What happens if you add whole milk versus skim milk and so forth. So we did a whole series of studies, and the contact people at Pillsbury, it took a while to convince them, conversations back and forth. They were worried, well, what if you don't get any results? And we kept saying, we will get results.
Right.
And by the way, that question is I've had that question thrown at me 10 years ago.
Right.
So I just want you to know it hasn't gone away. It's just people don't understand that you always obtain information. The question is it the information that's going to help the company make a business decision about a product? So that they were just absolutely fascinated with what we had done. And they got all this information that told them things about what blend of flour in a cake mix that had the flexibility. So if somebody added less water or more water, less milk or more milk, what would happen to the sensory experience?
Right.
So we got done with that project and we knew we really had something of great interest. And so we started to refine it. And finally in 74, we put a paper in. We published it in Food Technology, which is not the food technology you see today. And in the 70s, food technology was still, all the technical articles were peer reviewed. This was not a, infomercial or something. It was peer reviewed. We didn't put it into the Journal of Food Science because the submission to publication was 2.5 years.
Oh.
Yeah, let me tell you, it was a long time, and scientists were very, very unhappy. And so people weren't publishing in JFS.
Right.
Anyway, that's all changed. But food technology, and I think on the 50th anniversary of the founding of food technology, our paper was the 9th most cited article over that time period. It listed the top 10. The other one that was also sensory was the 9-point hedonic scale.
Right.
So the sensory people, we were thrilled with this because it was great recognition. 2 of the top cited articles were sensory.
Correct.
So we had we got a lot of influence in able to convince the powers that be at IFT to look upon our submissions with great favor.
Right.
But anyway, we studied to develop the method. We studied how many subjects, how many sessions you should use. We did 5 sessions, 10, 20 sessions, and see what happens. We would basically found that we would let the subjects develop the scorecard because they were going to evaluate the products.
Right. Wow, it's amazing the amount of work, and normally we do not know that that procedure. Is that procedure registered in some way, or
And it's all described in about 5 or 6 different places. Well, if you go look in the Sensory Evaluation Practices, the 5th edition, or there are a number of publications. In fact, there's one from CRC Press coming out sometime this year, and we have a good discussion there with lots of references to the step-by-step processes.
Nice.
Of course, when we first introduced it, as I said, we were successful with that Pillsbury study. It took more time for people to understand how to do it. The other problem was that there were very few companies had sensory scientists. So, for example, when we first went to Kraft, who asked us to come in and maybe install the method, they had no sensory people. They had just a few people that were doing something like it. So to do the method, if I were to do it today, starting with getting subjects, screening, language, I'd have data in 3 weeks. When we did it in the company during those early years, it took us 3 months.
Wow, yes.
And it had nothing to do with the method. It had to do, we had to teach, they would give us a panel leader, a person to be the sensory panel leader. We would give them literature to read, 50 papers. We'd come in and spend 3 days with them in a conference room, and essentially giving them a BS degree in sensory evaluation. And so it took a while. So it would take us 3 months. The tragedy of that was, to this day, there are people who say, how come QDA takes 3 months? And if they ask me, I say, how old were you in 1974? Oh, I wasn't born then. I said, well, I'll tell you, there were very few sensory people born then too. So naturally, it took time to teach people just sensory and then teach them something, how to, for example, we provided them with software package that would give them output in terms of means, variance measures, correlations, analyses of variance, and so forth. So we had to teach a class in statistics, had to teach classes in experimental design. So it was tedious, difficult, but we also learned a lot. Part of it, most of what we learned was that marketing people don't like numbers.
They want images. Yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing is technical people think they remember the numbers from the first test. They say, oh, we did another test, and instead of 25.6, we got 28. Something's wrong. Look at the variance measure, and so you have all these kinds of issues that crop up, and we realize, how do you communicate? So when you're familiar with the spider plots,
right?
The reason there are no numbers there is because we didn't want numbers on the plots. First, it made it visually difficult to follow. Second, some people would write down and we'd say, no, we'll give you the output. You can, no, they're writing the numbers down and we're thinking, oh my goodness, they're missing the point. This is, we say the numbers are important, but the first thing to understand is, how you formulate your product. You can technically reverse the competitors. So here are the differences between you and your competitor. What can you tell us about the two of them? So we realized we had to have just presenting results was fine, but then you had to have a working session to get the technical people to understand, one, they're not going to be fired because of our results. Two, we're there just to help them and teach them how to understand the information, because the brands people want to know do we make this change in the formulation before we do a test market or before we do a regional market? And in those days, they would say it's going to cost us a few $100,000. We can't afford to do a mistake. So,
Right.
of course, everybody gets a bit nervous about it. So we had to develop different ways. And I think, well, today with the software that's available, you can do magical because much of what we present is two-dimensional.
Right.
And the product is multidimensional. And consumer behavior is multidimensional. So at some point, we started doing multivariate analyses, and we're doing biplots and principal components analyses and doing the plots. And even at one point, although it took a lot of power, we did rotation so we could take the data and rotate it around to show, people how it works. So it's a learning process all around. But at the end of the day, the data stood up. I mean, we would get 5 years later, clients would connect with us again and say, you remember that data? I just want you to know that we're still using it. We're thinking, but my markets changed, pay attention. But I mean, it was solid data.
Wow. Huge story. I mean, it's amazing all the consideration that nowadays we are not aware of that, right? As you mentioned, it's pretty easy to do a spider graph or a PCA in a program, but
Yeah.
why or how did you arrive to that idea of, okay, let's do this analysis? We are not aware of that. We forgot that part, and that's one strong part of sensory
Well,
basic, right?
without belaboring it, that the Stanford faculty, there were people at SRI where I was, a mathematician in particular, just a brilliant man, wrote software. He was the one who wrote the software for the code on all the checks, the characters on the bottom. He did that. He did that software, and he was famous at IBM as the guy who could write software. You never needed to beta test it because it was correct. And so they would show us what they could do, what you could do with your data. Part of the problems that they were confronted with in the 80s was that the hardware software was not as sophisticated as it is today. So it was more difficult to do that sort of work. And for some clients who felt it was useful, we could do that for them. And so we would do some pretty interesting work in Japan and the UK. We used to do these worldwide studies where we take a product set, do the descriptive analysis, the client would do the physical chemical analyses, and then they would do preference testing in 10 countries. Then we would collect all the data and integrate it. To see what were the commonalities and attributes and how did they relate to the preferences, and were the preferences different? Again, this is always on a blind basis. So there was the imagery work that we did later on when we started to get the marketing and brands executives interested. We could integrate imagery with the sensory information.
What is the best part of doing sensory analysis?
The best part?
Yep.
Yeah, well, the best part is going to a supermarket or any store that have some international brands or national brands, and there's the product you worked on, and you have that satisfaction of knowing, oh, they've made the changes just as we recommended, based on the sensory information.
Right.
So I would say that's the greatest satisfaction you can have. The other part is when we used to do short courses, and then 10, 20 years later, as you know, we'd meet, people would come up and say, oh, you don't remember me, but I was at your course. I've done a lot of work in Japan and China and Japan, and I've had, actually, we had descriptive panels going there for one company for 27 years, and they weren't the same people. Over time, you have to drop people out because they lose focus or whatever. So we developed a replacement system, etc. So and you have these panels being used. I can recall being given 6.5 minutes to address the board of directors for a major corporation in Japan, and so I did, and it was using descriptive information. Of course, they were never seen anything like this at all. So you get a lot of satisfaction when two things, seeing your products and encountering sensory people that I either worked with or attended classes, and they tell you how much they learned or how they used the work.
Right. Yeah, I guess. I mean,
and they paid their bills.
Oh, yeah, of course. That's important.
First of all, if you don't qualify subjects based on sensory skill, I can't accept the testing you do.
Okay.
That's number one. You know, all subjects are consumers, but not all consumers can be subjects. When we do screening tests doing discrimination with the products, 30% of the people can't discriminate it better than chance.
Okay.
So when you're doing discrimination testing or descriptive analysis, any sensory analytical test, you really need to screen subjects. And what the best way is to use a difference test to determine how well they can discriminate an array of differences, small, large differences. And you'd be surprised that the people don't know how to take a test. So, you know, subjects have to learn how to take a test, have to learn to follow instructions. They have to exhibit sensory skill.
Right.
If you think about it, when marketing research fields a study, they have a very specific profile of the consumer they want to test. So it's specific in terms of household income, family size, etc. Sensory, while that's interesting, it's a sensory test, it's a skill. So what we want to know is, can you discriminate differences at better than chance? And in fact, when we screen subjects in 3 days, give them an hour-and-a-half session each of 3 days, we start out with easy, moderate, and difficult differences. And you might be surprised to see what the performance is when we do this. We find it takes about 25 to 30 trials. So we do it over three days, 3 sessions. And then we're ready to take the subject in to do actual testing. If it's discrimination, it's one thing. And also, when you're doing a sensory test, a sensory scientific discrimination descriptive, you need to do repeated trials. If you don't, what method analysis can you use? It's a one-way analysis of variance or a t-test. You can't sort out variance differences, etc. So from my perspective, when I served as editor at Journal of Food Science, a manuscript came in sensory, I would read it and I would look first for the objective, and I would go to the methodology to find out if they did repeated trials. And if there's nothing said about it, I would send the manuscript back and ask the question, did you do repeated trials? What analysis did you use? And so it was important to understand, when all else fails and people don't believe the results, they don't like the results, so they complain. So they
Right.
question it. If you hadn't done repeated trials and you haven't screened the subjects, what do you say? Well, we use subjects, and someone might be smart enough to read a little bit to say, well, where'd the subject come from? How do you know they're the right subjects? Do they use our product? And if you're able to point out, yeah, they use our products, and here's what we did to screen them before they did the actual test.
Right.
It's all about beta risk,
I know. Yep.
alpha, beta risk, and it's critical for analytical testing.
Nice. Yep. Okay. Thank you. That's very illustrating. It's important. I mean, before doing whatever thing, you need to know, of course, your objective and etc.
Oh yeah, that's something that it's not an exception, but it's very common. If you're meeting with a company about a test, so you start asking questions. More often than not, about, let's just say, at least 50% of the time, the people you're talking with, you're going to do the testing with, can't explain to you
Right.
how the information will be used.
Right.
I would often say, well, what is the objective? If they look at me and say, okay, let me put this to you another way. When I present you with the data and you look at it, what do you do with it? Oh, I have to report to this technical leader. I would say, does he know what sensory information looks like? Are you sure this is what they can't answer the purpose. I've been in meetings where we've been asked to leave the meeting and go to the company coffee shop because an argument has started between the brands people, the technical people, the product development people, and the production people. They all have different ideas and they're starting to yell at each other. And at some point, someone stops and said, "Excuse me, Herbert, would you mind taking a short break with your associate? Frank here will take you down to the cafe." And it's sometimes it's embarrassing, but it's important to understand. People sometimes say, well, we don't want you to bias the test. We have to say to them, I personally am not going to give the subjects the products. You can code them any way you want. You don't have to tell me, as long as you say, this is code Zaza and this is code blah, blah. We're not going to bias the test. We just want to make sure that the test we're doing is the appropriate test for your problem. And sometimes they're not sure what the problem really is.
Right. So in order to solve it, go ahead, please.
Yeah, because you can't design a test and expect to be halfway successful if you don't know where the information is going to end up. If it ends up on somebody's desk or workstation and he or she doesn't understand what this is all about.
Yeah, can be misleading, or you can have, but you have, as you said, you have information, but you don't know what to do with that.
Yeah, this is occasionally we would get called in to deal with this kind of an issue, and they'd ask us, well, what do we do? We say, well, it's not our data. We can't tell you. I said, if you'd like, you can go back to the company, whoever did it, and you can ask, here's a list of questions to ask them. But I said, faced with what we see, we don't know how to tell you what to do about it, just so I think one of the challenges and one of the benefits is these kinds of situations. They're like a mystery story or a puzzle, trying to figure out what the nature of the problem is. You've designed a study for it. Now, how do they want to use the information?
Right.
And it becomes very critical, especially when they want to correlate the sensory information with preference, purchase intent, and so forth. And they want to cut, slice and dice the data. And you got to understand, which consumers are you looking at? We've had clients as few as 15 subjects that were consumers of a certain age and a certain grouping. We're looking at them and saying, well, That's 15 people. That's not actionable. You should have told us in advance. We would have discussed, so in the future we work with them. We'd sit down and spend a long time on saying, so what kind of subjects, what's the common denominator amongst the population? High drinkers, low competitive drinkers, etc. I mean, you can't sometimes, the cost of the market research based on the consumer criteria was so expensive,
Right.
it wasn't worth doing. I mean, it's just, we would say to them, it's just not worth it for you to do this. They couldn't understand until we gave them the price tag and they said, we agree.
Right.
Now, of course, people now run on the internet all the time and can get hundreds and thousands of judgments. But the big challenge is, so, I mean, if you need, frankly, if you need that many data to prove a point, you don't have a real, you have a statistical effect, not a practical effect, forget it. We would say, all right, take the first 100 you collected and analyze it and tell me what you got out of it. If you have to get out to 487 subjects before you get significance, you don't have anything, you know.
Right.
Yeah, it's the curse of N.
Right. Yeah, based on all the experience you have from training people, which will be, if any, the minimum skills that a sensory scientist must have? I mean, uh, about the formation or the personality issues. Do you have something that can be, okay, this is the best bet?
Well, certainly, sensory scientists have to know how to design a study. That's a balanced block design. So sometimes they say, well, we're using a Latin square, and we'd say, well, a Latin square is the worst thing to do because you're going to have a situation in which product 7 is tested after product 1 9 times and one the reverse of that 1 time. So you're getting, if there's a product effect, it's going to carry over, it's going to cause a problem. So you need to think of balanced block designs, especially for discrimination tests, because they're small panel tests. You're using 20, 25 subjects maximum. That's something else they need to understand. If you plot significance versus the number of subjects, the line for significance goes like that. When it gets to that leveling off at asymptotes, doing more testing is a waste of time. You're not getting anything more. You know, it's too few is you only have 10 or 12 judges and you only got 10 or 20 judgments. You don't have enough judgments to extrapolate to a larger population. If you make one of those plots, there's one in our book on discrimination. Sensory people have to know how to design and study. They have to taste product before making a decision as to what test they want to use. You know, a paired comparison, the subject tastes 2 samples and makes a decision. Right. A duo trio, the subject does 2 paired comparisons, reference with A, reference with B. Triangle test is A with B, B with C, A with C. So now you've got 3 paired comparisons. So if you have a strong flavor that lingers on the palate, using a triangle test is going to push the direction of not finding significance because you get more sensory fatigue. So you have to think about the product to decide what you're going to do, what's the most appropriate method, always to minimize beta risk, not saying there's no difference when in fact there is. You know, in the food business, as you know, most companies do work where they're changing an ingredient, changing a process. They do not want the consumer, they want the least number of consumers to notice the change. to minimize beta risk.
Mhm.
So you need to make sure that whatever you do, you design the test that minimizes beta risk. The other part of the design, the sensory person needs to know, that's why you have replication. You do a second trial so you can look at the data when tested first, when tested second, so you understand that kind of information.
Mhm, mhm.
Pardon me, well,
Yeah, no problem.
I had a crazy call. I never get calls on my phone unless I'm on a Zoom call. Sorry.
No problem.
So, I mean, I think that if sensory scientists understand that in statistics, they have to understand that when they do analyses, they have to use behavioral statistics, not engineering statistics. And the reason, primary reason, is because behavioral statistics assumes interactions. You know, engineering statistics, they turn a knob A and knob B, and those are independent. They're not interactive. You change a formulation and the subjects, you know, things change. So they have to understand and they have to know about t-test, standard deviation, summary statistics, and then they
Mhm.
also have to know the analysis of variance. And nowadays, they should certainly be able to go into multivariate analyses where you're doing design studies.
Mhm.
So you do, you know, general linear model with repeated trials, designs, and so forth. So sensory scientists have to know that if they understand those issues, understand those disciplines, the more complex problems are just layering one thing on another. But if they
Right.
don't understand the basics, they get misled and you know, people jump from, they collect the data and they go to a PCA.
Mhm.
And I have to ask her, well, were there differences amongst the subjects? As you know, principal components analyses, factor analyses, they'll iterate till they get a solution. That doesn't mean it's real. It could be just it's inherent in this in the analysis. So they need to understand those kinds of issues. But that comes with first understanding the basics.
Yeah. Which is the best part.
Yes.
Yeah, Dr. Stone, time flies, and I just realized that we covered almost an hour, but I have many
Oh,
questions. If you allow me, I can ask three more questions. And the, the
sure.
the first one will be, if you could tell something to Herbert Stone back in the 60s via a letter or in an inspiration or something, what would you say to him before doing the first sensory contact? I mean, do you have something to suggest him?
You know, setting up a test takes a lot of time and effort and concentration. I would always tell the person who's managing the test
Mhm.
to take a moment to go to just relax and then step by step go through each of the sequences, recheck the codes to make sure that everybody in the staff are are in agreement and they're correct. And the other point we would always say, certainly to the servers, if you think you've
Mhm.
made a mistake in serving, please tell the manager right away. You won't be criticized. We want to get the test right. So, and don't hide it because it'll show up in the data and then we'll have to trace back everything and find out. So, um, are you sure everything's ready? The codes are correct. You haven't mixed up the product codes. I cannot tell you how many times these things happen. So, word to the wise is important to take a few minutes before the subjects arrive to go through every step in the process.
Right. Okay. What does it feels? What in your case? What do you feel like being a reference in the sensory world and seeing all this evolution from the very beginning at today? What is your feeling about that?
Well, I have a very good feeling, but there's always a nagging doubt. It's the sensory people in the corporate world. Everything is driven by speed and the need to get things done quickly. And this translates down to the very basic level of sensory testing to they have to do things quickly and cut corners. So I think the big challenge is how to stay calm in chaos. And the other aspect to that has to do with the internet. You can access all kinds of information on the internet, but there's no filter. And you have to be the filter when you're looking at sensory information or quote unquote sensory methods. There are a multitude of methods out there. Many of them are driven by a graduate student has to publish. So of course the professor is anxious for the student to get experience. So they take on all kinds of project work. They publish things. And I think this is exciting. But at the same time, you have to always remind people. We would get these calls, oh, they were reading the literature. They want to know what they should do about this method because somebody in technical came to them and asked them why they're not doing this method.
Right.
Teaching how to manage this crisis and this crisis in the making.
Right.
How to read literature and make decisions as to, is this of interest to us? And if it is, how can we do some work without taking a lot of time to find out if it's applicable?
Okay. Thank you. And you have been or doing many activities like consultancy. You have been a professor, researcher, AFFE president. Which one did you enjoy the most?
My sensory life.
Okay.
My sensory life is found to be most important. I will say that the sensory involves psychology. It involves how to design experiment, how to think. I found that extremely useful when I was IFT president.
Right.
The science part of it was a great advantage to me when I served as a reviewer and associate editor, and then finally editor of Journal of Food Science. But it was the sensory was the big part.
Right. Thank you. And thank you very much for your time and to sharing your story and experiences. I'm sure that many people will continue to be inspired by your experience and find this interview enlightening. Anything else you want to add?
No, thank you. I'm happy to be here, chat with you.
Thank you.
Excuse me. And if anyone wants to send me questions, I'm happy to respond. Sometimes I may be traveling but I get back to everybody I can. So feel free to ask me questions.
Okay. Do you have a LinkedIn contact or web page that people can contact you?
No, I don't have a web page.
Okay.
But if they want to contact me at that email and I can respond.
Sure. Perfect. Doctor, thank you again so much, and hopefully we can see in another time and exchange some words, and why not a coffee or a beer? It depends.
Thank you. Muchas gracias, señor.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
No, thanks to you. A ustedes muchas gracias por por escucharnos. Nos vemos en la siguiente emisión de Diálogos Sensoriales. Si les gustó, denle like y compartan. Si no, no digan nada. Nos vemos en la siguiente. Chao, chao. See you next time, doctor.